exchange, like, the same way their parents would recite in Urdu, the children also do the same thing. And the same way the parents did in Arabic, the children also do the same thing. So sometimes even compose, they'll have the ability and the skill to be able to compose in that foreign language, and that will be the way those youngsters stay connected to the tradition. But that's not always the case. In fact, it's probably usually not the case, right? More often than not, there's a disconnect, and the younger generation feels like they've lost a sense of connectedness to these commemorations, and they're not sure what the meaning is anymore. Why are we doing this, and what's the point of doing it? Especially when it's in a foreign language and done in ways that are very different from anything else that they know in life. It's very challenging for them to connect and think, how is it possible that every day is Ashura, when the Ashura commemorations are so different from every other day that I spend in my life, right? So these challenges are there, and we're at this kind of crossroads, it's not going to end. It's going to continue. It's a dynamic process, and it's up to us to wade through this and stay united as a community and work through all of these differences, this dynamism, and make sure that we keep the goal in mind, which is to individually get closer to Allah, but then maintain this richness and this diversity that we have in the community in a way that we overall we're promoting this culture of remembering Allah, remembering the Ahlul Bayt, and staying close to them and doing whatever we can to get closer to them. So one of the ways to help us through and ease us through this process is through reflection, kind of rethinking every year how, what is the goal, what is the purpose of the commemoration, what have we been doing until now, and do things need to change in any way, what things are good from before, and what things can be improved on in the future. Now, there's a lot that we can say about the meaning of Karbala itself, and I don't want to focus too much on that. That, inshallah, will come as the days progress and we speak more about the story. The youth lectures are wonderful. That idea of having youngsters prepare and then present to you it's a great way for them to become engaged with the story and hopefully kind of start to process that story. But I want to think a little bit more about the commemorations themselves, right? The actual commemoration as opposed to the event. Right? The event is a historical event that had certain significance and certain importance for us, and that's something that we should reflect on and benefit from. But the other aspect of it is the commemoration itself. And one of the things that I've come to the realization of over time is I've realized that this is the commemoration itself is a very interesting thing and a very important thing. One of the interesting aspects of it is that it's an institution that the Ahlul Bayt themselves have established. Right? Sometimes we struggle with this idea of, did the Ma'sumin ever do things like this and have these sorts of majalis? Certainly they did. And they set the foundation for this institution. And hopefully on a nightly basis, I'd like to share with you, there's one really great book that we have, Sheikh Abbas al-Qummi. You all probably know him through Mafatih al-Jinan, which is a book that we use so often. He has many other books. One of his books about Karbala is An-Nafas al-Mahmoom. It's a maqtal of, and it's a very comprehensive kind of retelling of the whole story of Karbala. And in that, he begins his discussion by quoting 40 ahadith from the Ahlul Bayt about the commemoration of Ashura itself. And it really gives us a great window into the institution building that went into this whole thing from the side of the Ahlul Bayt. And what we see is that they, in various ways, they planted the seeds so that these commemorations could continue and take place. Right? One of the ways that they did that, they themselves practiced it. They themselves commemorated it. And we see that they put an incredible emphasis, a disproportionate emphasis on Imam Hussein versus any of the other predecessors or themselves. So Imam after Imam, after the event of Karbala, they would be seen publicly and privately engaging in these sorts of sessions where they would either themselves recount the story or encourage others to recount the story. So we see many ahadith mention how the Imams would patronize various poets, for instance, encourage them to recite poetry in remembrance of Imam Hussein. There's one that's, well, inshallah we'll get to it, but there's one that's interesting where the Imam encourages this one famous poet to recite a poem for Imam Hussein. He says, I've heard that you recite good poetry. Can I hear one about my grandfather, Imam Hussein? And the person, very probably maybe a little bit nervous, reciting in front of the personality of the imam, he recites his poem in a very formal way. And as soon as he starts, the imam says, "No, no, stop, stop. That's not the way I want it. Recite it the way you recite it when you're amongst yourselves, when I'm not around. That's the way I want to hear it. Right? Don't make it all formal and proper for me. Right? Do it the same way you guys do it when you're by yourselves in your own sessions. That's the way I want to hear it." And he starts, and the imam cries, and then gives a substantial sum of money to the person to encourage him to continue in this effort. They not only did they do it themselves, they've commanded us to do it, to commemorate year after year. They've encouraged us. Just think of all of basically every event of the Islamic calendar, right? One of the a'mal for the event is a ziyarah of Imam Hussein. I think about basically any event you can think of, the 15th of Sha'ban, or I don't know, Laylatul Qadr, or I don't know, just anything you can think of. One of the a'mal is generally a ziyarah for Imam Hussein, alayhi salam. Ghadir, for instance, everything you can think of. So they've told us to do that. Not only that, but they've also dangled carrots in front of us, and they've offered all sorts of great reward for even the simplest form of commemoration that you can think of. Right, so we have these hadith that say, for instance, anyone who recites a poem for the sake of Imam Hussein, then he gets paradise. Anyone who makes 10 people cry, different numbers, like 10 people cry, paradise. Even one person, it makes one person cry, paradise. A person who cries and a drop falls down his cheek, paradise. Even if you can't cry, but you kind of put yourself into the disposition and the mood, by putting your hand down, your head in your hand, for instance, or just kind of assuming the position of someone crying, even that has such great reward, right? So they've offered these great rewards, all of this for the sake of building this institution, which is these commemorations that we're now participating in. When that's the case, we should realize that this is something much bigger than what we sometimes attribute to it. What I mean is that sometimes we search for the individual benefit of, for instance, attending these commemorations, right? So oftentimes people, when they're rethinking, like, should I attend these speeches or not? What benefit is there? They'll think about their own personal benefit. How do I benefit as a person from listening to this lecture? What am I going to learn, for instance, from this particular speech? And so it becomes a very kind of, you can think of it as selfish. That's fine. That's certainly a consideration. We should think, how much am I going to benefit from it? But that's not the extent of the benefit of these commemorations. There's something much bigger. There's a societal sort of a benefit for this that we should think about, and not only think of it as an individual benefit. Recently, I had the opportunity and the blessing to go to Hajj, and I made a similar kind of realization at Hajj, that this is a very different kind of worship than anything else I'd ever engaged in. And so usually when we think of worship, we think of quiet contemplation, just you and God, and just quiet time. That's kind of a hallmark of worship, I think, when we usually think of worship. And Hajj is none of that, right? Those of you who have been to Hajj, you know that it's completely non-private. It's the most public thing you can do. It's chaotic. It doesn't give you the time to sit quietly and reflect in peace and quiet. That's not at all what Hajj does. And it's not just a modern phenomenon that now Hajj is like this. It's always been like this. From the time of the Prophet, it was like this. It was always a time of huge crowds and rush and pushing and all these different things that we experience now. It's always been like that, right? The nature of Hajj is something much different from other kinds of worship that we have. That quiet, reflective worship, that happens in Salatul Layl. That happens in our prayer during our quiet dua times, i'tikaf, when we kind of seclude ourselves and worship. Those are the times for quiet reflection. Hajj is a very different kind of worship. There, we're thrown into these throngs. There's all of this stuff happening, and despite all of that, we have to reach out to Allah. And it's really kind of it's a microcosm of life. Right? Life, we can't call timeouts in life and say, it's too chaotic. Let me just, everyone stop and let me think. Right? Things just keep on happening, keep on coming at us in life, and somehow in the chaos of life, we have to connect with Allah. We have to be able to keep our sights on His pleasure and what we can do to get closer to Him, despite all of these things that are pulling us away from Him. And that's Hajj is kind of a crash course in how to do that. there's also something global about Hajj. And that's what I want to get to with Karbala as well. These commemorations, there's something very, very huge about this. And that's why the Imams have put so much effort into establishing this institution. These commemorations, one of the things that they give us is they give us a sense of identity. I kind of felt this and realized this for the first time recently. Earlier, I guess last year actually, I was at Arba'een time. I was able to go to Karbala for the first time, and that was an amazing experience. And I'll tell you one anecdote that I experienced there and how I benefited from that experience. One morning we had gone to Masjid al-Kufa, and it was a beautiful place, of course. But as the sun rose, there was a group of youngsters, youngsters meaning teenagers, all dressed in black, covered in mud. And one of the things that many of the reciters would do, and especially people who are kind of marching and reciting, they would purposely rub mud on themselves, on their heads and on their bodies to kind of show extra devotion to Imam Hussein as they were going towards Karbala. These people on their way to Karbala, they came through the masjid, and it had been peace and quiet before that. These youngsters, they came in reciting some Arabic poetry with a very kind of interesting rhythm to their matam. The way they were doing the latmiya was very interesting, and as soon as they came in, it was such a dynamic sort of a thing, and they had so much charisma. It just completely changed the atmosphere of the whole masjid. Like everyone started humming with them and reciting with them as they were reciting this poetry. Everyone kind of turned their attention to them. People, as they would pass by, people started doing the same matam as they were doing with the same rhythm. And it was just this amazing sight to see how this simple act of theirs had unified all these people and brought them all together in a way where they all felt so close. Right? It was just a very magnetic sort of a thing, and I started to realize that's one of the great things about this particular kind of commemoration that we have, this latmiya matam that we have. One of the benefits of that is that it's not simply there's a difference when someone's saying a marthiyah, for instance, and it's just one person reciting and everyone listening, and it's a different thing when somebody recites a poem or recites something where everyone can sing along, everyone can recite along, right? That all of a sudden everyone's a participant, everyone's part of it, everyone can be a team player, as opposed to just listening to someone reciting the Quran or reciting a marthiyah and these sorts of things. And that dynamic of bringing us together and giving us a sense of belonging, that I now belong to this community, I feel like I'm part of this community, that's really important. Now that's one of the things that we get from these communal commemorations of Ashura, which we would never get if it was just us by ourselves. Right? I could sit at home and read a book. I could read a maqtal of Imam Hussein, and I would be kind of doing the same thing. But the benefit of that is very different from the benefit of being part of this community and commemorating with people. Right? I could sit and listen to a lecture at home, just me and the internet, me and a tape, me and a CD. But that'd be a very different sort of a benefit that I would get from this kind of benefit of coming together and commemorating as a group. Right? So it gives us a sense of identity and belonging to a community, which is invaluable. Commemorating also, one of the other benefits of it is that it gives us it becomes part of our cultural fabric as Shia. Right? Every group has certain, sometimes we term for instance, groups will have inside jokes. Right? You have a group of friends and they've had certain experiences together, and down the road something will happen and someone will say a particular word which reminds everyone of that funny incident that happened, and everyone in that group will laugh. Anyone on the outside will have no clue what they're talking about, but the people who are part of the group, because it's an inside joke, they all understand exactly what it is, and it brings them together. That little illusion is possible because they have a shared experience. Right? That's what Karbala is for us. Right? Of course, that was a funny example with a joke. But this is the story of Karbala, the characters who are involved, the richness of this history. It becomes part of us to such an extent that all you have to say is Hussein, and everyone gets into a certain mood. Right? That reminded me of this one hadith that we have for with Zakaria and Yahya. So Zakaria, alayhi salam, the Prophet Zakaria, he is taught by Allah the names of the Ahlul Bayt according to this one hadith. And so he mentions their names to himself, Muhammad and Fatima and Ali and Hassan. And he says that whenever I mention these four names, I feel a sense of elation and happiness. But when I mention Hussein, suddenly I feel the sadness. The sadness overcomes me, right? And so Allah recalls for him what will happen to Imam Hussein and why this is the case. And he makes this deep connection with Imam Hussein. He says, if you're going to subject the final prophet, the best of your creatures, to such pain because of his son Hussein, then I want to also feel that same sort of pain. Whatever is good enough for him, I also want to be part of that. So give me a son also, and make that son as beloved to me as Hussein is to the Prophet, and then test me through that son. Right? Take him away from me in the same tragic way you'll take him away from the Prophet, and let me also experience that same pain so I can become close to you the way the Prophet's close to you. And because of that, we have this deep connection between Imam Hussein and Yahya alayhi salam. They're born after 6 months of gestation, for instance, and they were murdered in a similar way by illegitimate rulers of their times, and these sorts of things. So there are all these connections that we have between the two. Recite one salawat, please. And one more. The commemorations also serve to keep the story fresh for us as a community. I know when I was younger, maybe in college, and then as I started to explore 12-er Shi'ism more, but I wasn't 12-er Shia to begin with. I became a 12-er Shia in college. I remember having this thought that lectures sometimes, if a lecture doesn't give me something new, then it's not valuable. Like every day I want to hear something new. Every lecture has to give me some new idea. There's something to be said for that we do need new ideas. We do need to have new ideas, new thoughts. But there's also benefit in reminding ourselves and remembering things and going over the same thing over and over again, especially when it's something so significant as this event of Karbala. And so that's one of the benefits that we have from these kinds of commemorations, where year after year, for such a significant portion of the calendar year, we're recalling these stories and reminding ourselves of them, right? It's that benefit of making the things fresh in our mind. So it's not just something I read about that 20 years ago. I remember the gist of the story, but it's always at the tip of our tongue. As soon as we hear the story, we know what's coming next. We know everything. We know the characters. We know what they said. We know the response. All that becomes part of this culture that we have, and it adds to that identity. But there's great benefit in these recollections and kind of annual narrations of the story that we hear. Another benefit of these commemorations is the compassion and the softness that it creates in us. I felt this recently. I had these two experiences I mentioned, one at Karbala and then one at Hajj. And even with the people I was traveling with, we kind of reflected on this aspect of the people we were encountering at the two places. And certainly it's anecdotal, and I'm sure there's plenty of counterexamples to what I'm going to say. But there was an overwhelming sense that at Karbala, in the mix of all these Shia, with the same crowds and the same dirt and the same sweat and all the different things that you have to deal with, but the interactions were very different, right? You might there wasn't the same pushing and shoving, for instance. There wasn't the same kind of hardness between each other. If you accidentally push someone, you'd apologize. The person would apologize. You would apologize to the person, and there was this sense of compassion amongst the Zuwar of Imam Hussein that I didn't feel, of course, to such an extent in Hajj. There, especially the most blatant example of the opposite of that compassion, the harshness, is the people in charge, the Wahhabis who are there. They are such brutes, right? Such just callous people, have absolutely no emotion. And everyone, not only the Shia, but even the other Sunnis that were there, they felt this brutishness of these people who were in charge there. Right? So one of the things that this commemoration does is it makes us cry. Right? It makes us recall these people who had such a tragic story. And Again, it's anecdotal, and someone would have to go through and kind of study the psyche of Shia and compare them and all these sorts of things. But certainly this has a great effect on us. It makes us more attuned to the suffering of people. You'd be I would assume you'd be hard pressed to find a Shi'i who wouldn't um, uh, go out of his way to serve water to somebody, for instance, if they saw that that person needed water. There's no way, no matter who the person was and how much you dislike the person, if he needed water, we'd go out of our way to do that, right? That sense of compassion for suffering has been instilled in us to such an extent from the model and the example of Imam Hussein. So that's something that we should benefit from and realize that this institution that they have established, it has these sorts of benefits for us as a community, and it goes far beyond the individual benefit we might receive if we were to commemorate on our own. All of this that I've said, though, it depends on our ability to keep the commemorations of Ashura relevant to ourselves and the culture in which we live. I had another experience a couple of years ago that really opened my eye to this. I had been invited to Bahrain. This was just, I think it was a year or maybe 2 years before all of the strife that they're now experiencing. And so I went to Bahrain not really knowing what I would expect there. And I was invited to speak there by a group. There are 4 individuals who were kind of the head of this organization called Islamic Awareness. And 3 of them were Irani immigrants to Bahrain. I think they're 3rd generation or 4th generation Iranis who are now Bahraini. And the 4th one was a native Bahraini Arab. I was so amazed by these people's their forward thinking. I think it was the most forward-thinking group of people I've ever seen, or I've ever had the experience to be with during Muharram especially. These people in Bahrain, which is a very traditional society, they're some of the first Shia were Bahraini, right? One of the reasons why they were declared murtad by Abu Bakr in these wars of Ridda were fought against them was because they refused to accept him as the Khalifa. The Bahrainis, the Yemenis, and these different people in southern Arabia and these islands. They knew who Imam Ali was, and they had pledged their allegiance to him, and they wouldn't accept Abu Bakr in his place. So they were declared murtad by Abu Bakr. So these people, they've been Shia for a long time. And most of the commemorations there are very traditional commemorations. During the time of these first 10 days, the whole kind of old city of downtown Manama closes down, and there's just everything is commemoration of Ashura. They have all these tents, and the Husseinias are there and all these different things. But these people, in all of that, they realized that there's a large part of the population that needs an English program for Ashura. And so every year, these 4 people who don't even speak English that well themselves, but because of their forward thinking, they realized they needed to create this program for converts and for people who are not Arab speakers or Persian speakers and so forth. And so just everything about the program was amazing. They advertised very well, so they really publicized their program. They placed themselves on the very edge of that old city, so that it was very easy for someone who was maybe not familiar with the culture, maybe a little bit unsure about what to expect and stuff. It was very easy for them to get there because they didn't have to go through much of the old city. They could just drive their car, park, and the first tent they got to was the English-speaking program. They just the whole setup. The audience, it was maybe 500 people. It was all set up in a big tent outside with chairs. Most of the audience, a lot of the women in the audience were Filipino converts or other kind of East Asian, South Asian converts who had married Arab husbands. They were housekeepers and nannies and these sorts of things. How they're in the Gulf states, they bring these people in for these functions, and they had married into Bahraini culture and become Shia. So this was their way. This is really their only way of being educated about Islam through these programs. And then they asked their members who were expatriates themselves to reach out to their co-workers who were non-Muslim and encourage them to come. It was one of the things that the Bahraini government was doing to counteract the Shia, suppress the Shia. They would spread these false rumors about the Shia. They would say, for instance, don't nobody should go into downtown Manama because there these gangs of thugs that will beat you up if you go there. And by scaring people, then they would discourage them from even thinking about going to downtown because they'd be afraid of this sort of these sorts of activities. Or they say don't eat the food of these people at these they call them matams. They're Husseinias, they call them matams. Don't eat the food that they offer you because they spit at it or they'll poison it. These different things like that, just to scare people into not even having contact and not even thinking that maybe there's something to offer here. But these people, they reached out to them, and every night there would be at least 20, 30 people, Caucasians from America or Europe or different places, coming with their Shia friends to the programs to find out what all this is about. So many people converted through these programs. It was an amazing experience. One of the things that they had done, they had asked me to, of course, give my speech in English. They had every aspect of their program was English. Right, so even the musiba, the masa'ib after my speech, they had one of their people who was a very good storyteller. He came up and from beginning to end through the 10 days, he recounted the whole story for the audience in English in a very, very beautiful way. And I remember at the very end, they had a play. Each night they would kind of reenact some portion of the tragedy in a play, but then to make sure they didn't offend anyone's sensibilities, they made it a shadow play. Next, they had a screen, and then all the characters were behind the screen, and they had a spotlight from behind, so all you could see was the shadows in the front, and they had a voiceover and stuff like that. Just it was amazing, creative, forward-thinking, culturally relevant, and it was exactly what was needed over there. That for me was a model for the way we should also be thinking about these commemorations. It's true that we have a richness from our old cultures, from other countries and other cultures that we've experienced, but oftentimes we'll find that they don't exactly translate into where we are now. Right? Language is a huge thing. If our commemorations of Ashura are bound to a non-native language, a non-English language, it's a huge disservice to the entire institution of what this is all about, especially because we have such a mix. Right? The common language here is English. Definitely the program, as much as we can, should be in English, and we should try to make it more and more English so there's more and more of a reach. One of the things we find is that we need to be able to communicate these ideas both for ourselves and also for other people. Right? Our children, for instance, if our entire experience of Karbala is simply through listening, especially if it's listening to either a foreign language commemoration or a commemoration that's not very well done, that's not very beautiful, for instance. If that's our only experience with it, how much are we going to be able to turn around and translate that either into our own lives or translate that experience for other people? Right? Ask your child, ask yourself. If you go out to a coworker, to a neighbor, and try to explain what happens here during these 10 days, right? Challenge yourself to doing that. It's actually very difficult. If all of your experience of Karbala and Ashura is here and in this context and in this language and with our keywords and our buzzwords that we ourselves understand, it's very hard when you try to speak about it to somebody who has no idea, no Arabic at all, no background at all, to try to tell them, about what this whole thing is about, what Ashura is about, and who Imam Hussein is, and why this is so important. Right? All that can only happen if, one of the steps to making that happen is to make sure these commemorations, the speeches themselves, even the artistic parts of it, the marthiyah, the noha, these different things are also done in beautiful English. That's one of the things that I've recognized in Farsi culture and Urdu culture. Those are the two that I have kind of seen the closest. I think because they have such a long history of commemorating in their language, they've found a way to do it beautifully. Their language and the culture of Ashura is so intermingled that you have all the words, all the vocabulary that you need to tell the story of Ashura at your hands. It's already been done. It's all there. It's all part of the culture, part of the language, and it's very easy to draw on that and speak beautifully and eloquently about those events and tell the story in a beautiful way. Doing that in English is very challenging. right? Even I'm a completely native English speaker, right? But I struggle, if I'm to try to tell the story in the same way, we don't have that same storytelling culture, that same poetic culture yet in the Shia community on the English side as we have in those other languages. But that has to change. That has to develop, right? It happens organically, and it will happen organically, but we can speed along the process and participate in it and encourage it and foster it. And to the extent that we can do that, it's going to benefit us, benefit our children. These teachings can then permeate and translate into our lives, and then we can turn around and talk about it to other people, let them know what it's all about, and tashayyu then becomes something beautiful. The famous hadith of Imam Rida alayhi salam is that if people only knew, recite salawat please. If people only knew the beauty of our words, they would follow us. Right? They've done their part. They've made the teachings of Islam are beautiful. All the teachings of the Ahlul Bayt are beautiful. The story of Karbala is beautiful. Everything's beautiful about it. But it's how well we can translate that for people and tell people about that. That's going to be the deciding factor of whether they follow the Ahlul Bayt or not. If they only knew the words, they would follow them. Right? Our job is to be that liaison and kind of translate the ideas and the stories and the teachings for them, and the rest will happen automatically. All right, recite one salawat for me, please. In the coming days, I want to just briefly introduce the topic so you know what to expect. What I'd like to speak about is to encourage ourselves to rethink some of the paradigms that are around us. Right? There are certain paradigms that surround us, that are kind of ingrained in the culture around us, that we possibly take for granted. And if we take those paradigms for granted, it can have very, very devastating consequences for us. Let me give you an example so you understand what I'm talking about. A paradigm is a model, right, or kind of a way of thinking about something. I've recently been studying some scientific studies about the floods of the world, specifically addressing the flood of Noah, Prophet Noah, to see whether there's any archaeological or geological evidence for a flood. So one of the paradigms that a lot of the Christian world has adopted because of the way the Bible is written is that they think that the world is a young world, meaning it's only 6,000 years old, right? Because that's the timeline that the Bible gives. So those who are literalists in how they read the Bible, their paradigm for how they think of the world is that it's a world that's 6,000 years old, right? Once they have that paradigm in mind, and then they come up against modern scientific research that shows that no, it's actually much older, much older. Because they've already assumed a certain paradigm, they run into a conflict, and they have to either reject the scientific research and say it's false, or they have to challenge their own understanding and then the Bible itself and their whole religion. And because that's the timeline that they've assumed, the flood of Noah, they placed it around 5,000 years ago. Right, and since that the Bible kind of puts that time frame on it, it then allows geologists and scientists in general to evaluate the truthfulness of that statement and see 5,000 years ago, was there any worldwide flood? And there wasn't. Was there any even regional flood of that magnitude that was kind of a unique type of incident? And they find that's also not the case. That 5,000 years ago, there was no such regional flood. And so this creates this huge, so many problems because of that paradigm, that false paradigm that they came up with at first, and from which which is like their point of reference. This causes this incredible conflict with the scientific community, and the effect for the rest of us has been that scientists, because they can reject this particular version of the Noah story, they assume that the Noah story is false altogether. They'll say this is all just a myth and a legend. Right? So there's a lot more to that story, but my point is then that this paradigm is extremely important. What paradigm do we start with? What's the source of that paradigm? Is it a true paradigm that's based on reality or not? If we adopt and choose the wrong paradigm, then we're going to constantly face conflict. in our own lives. Internal conflict, conflict with knowledge, conflict with science, conflict with the world around us. So we want to make sure that the paradigms around us that we are experiencing, that we're being fed, if they are, we want to make sure that they are legitimate paradigms. And if they're not, we want to think about them critically, analyze them, see where they're wrong, see why they're wrong, and see how we can replace them with other paradigms and make sure that we're not subject to those kinds of false paradigms. Because if we have that, then it's going to have devastating consequences for us as people, and we're going to live lives that are very, very distant from Islam. Islam has paradigms to offer to replace those, but it's up to us to have an open, kind of open and critical view of these paradigms in the first place. So inshallah, I'm going to try to spend each night speaking about one of these paradigms and kind of paint a picture for you, and then help us to kind of walk through analyzing it and breaking that down. We are going to have Q&A kind of at the end of each lecture. What I'd like to do, not today so much, but in coming nights, I'll present the lecture for maybe 35, 40 minutes, and then we'll break for a Q&A, kind of relevant to the discussion at hand. So if I said something that's unclear, I want you to clarify it right away. Ask me about it, challenge me, right, so that we can resolve that thing right away. Right? You shouldn't. I'm not a controversial type of a person. I'm not someone who says things just off the cuff and without thinking. If I say something and it sounds odd, or even wrong, then chances are either you misunderstood me or maybe I misspoke, right? But it needs to be clarified so that you don't go away. I say that with some emphasis because I recently, somebody brought up a question that they had from one of my lectures. I was here like 6 years ago or 5 years ago. At that time, they had a confusion in one of my talks here, and just recently he had confronted me about it and said, all these years I've had a question about something you talked about then. And it hurt me so much that it's taken so long to resolve that. I wish I had been able to have the opportunity to resolve it right away, so we wouldn't have to spend these 6 years in confusion over something that he had misunderstood from my lecture. Right? So definitely clarify those things right away, and then I think there's some opportunity also for other kinds of questions that are not necessarily tied to my topics, through emails and through comment cards. I'll let maybe the organizers will introduce that and tell you how that's going to work. With that, let me share with you one of those hadith that I mentioned from the Ahlul Bayt. This is a hadith, I'm sure you've heard it, but it's wonderful again to kind of recall it, and it sets the tone for these commemorations. This is a hadith from the time of the 8th Imam, and he had a companion by the name of Ar-Rayyan ibn Shabib, who was actually an Abbasid. Right? He was tied to the caliph of the time, Al-Mu'tasim. The narration says that he was the khal of Mu'tasim, the mamu of Mu'tasim. Despite that, he was a close disciple of the 8th Imam. So Rayyan comes in and he says, دخلت على أبي الحسن الرضا صلوات الله عليه في أول يوم من المحرم. So on the first day of Muharram, like a day like tomorrow, he comes and he meets the 8th Imam. And Imam's first question is, Ya ibn Shabib, are you fasting today? Right? And Ibn Shabib says, no, I'm not fasting. He says, إن هذا اليوم هو اليوم الذي دعا فيه زكريا ربه. He says, this is the anniversary of the day on which Zakaria, the prophet, prayed to Allah. Right? Remember the story from the Quran where he enters the sanctuary where Maryam is. He sees the food being given to her from through supernatural means, and he's so moved by the blessing of Allah that he stands right there in his place of worship, and he prays to Allah and says, Allah, give me a son who will inherit me, and so forth. So he says this is the day on which Zakaria did this. He said, Rabbi habli min ladunka dhurriyatan tayyibah innaka sami'ud du'a. فاستجاب الله له وأمر الملائكة فنادت زكريا وهو قائم يصلي في المحراب أن الله يبشرك بيحيى. So on this day he prayed, and right then Allah he accepted the prayer. He sent the angels to tell him immediately that you have been given glad tidings that you'll have a son named Zakaria. فمن صام هذا اليوم ثم دعا الله عز وجل استجاب الله له كما استجاب لزكريا. So on this day, the first of Muharram, we're encouraged to fast. And the Imam says, if anyone fasts on this day, and then prays like Zakaria prayed, then Allah will answer the prayer like he answered for Zakaria. Right, so that's one of the things that we should try to do for tomorrow. If you're able to and circumstances allow you, it's mustahab to fast on the first of Muharram. Right, actually for the first 9 days of Muharram it's mustahab, but this day in particular because of this hadith. Yeah, so if you're able to, then try to take advantage of that. There are also some a'mal. There's a two rak'ah prayer to be offered during the day tomorrow. So if you're able to do that, and if you have the time, that's a good thing to do as well. ثم قال يا ابن شبيب إن المحرم هو الشهر الذي كان أهل الجاهلية فيما مضى يحرمون فيه الظلم والقتال لحرمته. So he says, Rayyan, this month of this month of Muharram, this is a month that during the Jahiliyyah had such sanctity in the hearts of people that they would forbid any sort of violence, any sort of killing during this month. Right? They suspend war and everything because of the sanctity of this month. فما عرفت هذه الأمة حرمة شهرها ولا حرمة نبيها. But this ummah of Muslims, ironically, even though they're not in the Jahiliyyah anymore, right? Even though in the Jahiliyyah they respected the sanctity of the month, the Muslims of this ummah did not respect the sanctity of this month. And during this month, they broke both the sanctity of the month and the sanctity of the Prophet. لقد قتلوا في هذا الشهر ذريته وسبوا نساءه وانتهبوا ثقله. During this month, they slaughtered the family of that Prophet. They imprisoned the women from his family, and they looted their belongings. فَلَا غَفَرَ اللَّهُ لَهُمْ ذَلِكَ أَبَدًا. May Allah never forgive those people who perpetrated that ever. يَا ابْنَ شَبِيب إِن كُنْتَ بَاكِيًا لِشَيْءٍ فَابْكِي لِلْحُسَيْنِ ibn Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salam. If you're going to cry for anything, then the first thing you should cry for, the first person you should cry for is Imam Hussein. ذُبِحَ كَمَا يُذْبَحُ الْكَبْشِ. He was slaughtered the way a ram is slaughtered. وَقُتِلَ مَعَهُ مِنْ أَهْلِ بَيْتِهِ 18 رَجُلًا مَا لَهُمْ شَبِيهُونَ فِي الْأَرْضِ. And along with him, 18 people from his Ahlul Bayt were also slaughtered. And these were people who were unmatched by anyone else on earth. وَلَقَدْ بَكَتِ السَّمَاوَاتُ السَّبْعُ وَالْأَرَضُونَ لِقَتْلِهِ. And because of his murder, the heavens and the earth veritably cried for his sake. وَلَقَدْ نَزَلَ إِلَى الْأَرْضِ مِنَ الْمَلَائِكَةِ 4,000 لِنَصْرِهِ فَوَجَدُوهُ قَدْ قُتِلَ. 4,000 angels were sent down. They came down to help him, but when they came, they found that he had already been killed. فَهُمْ عِنْدَ قَبْرِهِ شُعْثٌ غُبْرٌ إِلَىٰ أَنْ يَقُومَ الْقَائِمُ عَلَيْهِ السَّلَامُ. So these angels now, because they weren't able to help him then, they're there in this kind of disheveled state of those who commemorate Ashura. They're in this disheveled state, and they'll remain there at his grave until the time when the Mahdi comes back alayhi salam. فَيَكُونُونَ مِنْ أَنصَارِهِ وَشِعَارُهُمْ يَا لَثَارَاتِ الْحُسَيْنِ عَلَيْهِ السَّلام. Right, these angels then will, at that time, they'll be helpers of the Imam of our time. Because they weren't able to help Imam Hussein, they'll at least help the Mahdi alayhi salam. And they will call out when they attack, their war cry will be for the vengeance of Hussein, for the blood of Hussein we fight. يا ابن شبيب لقد حدثني أبي عن أبيه عن جده أنه لما قتل جدي الحسين عليه السلام أمطرت السماء دما وترابا أحمر. He says that my father, from his grandfather, from his father, has told me that when Hussein was killed, the sky rained down blood and red dirt. يا ابن الشبيب إن كنت بكيت على الحسين عليه السلام حتى تصير دموعك على خديك غفر الله لك كل ذنب أذنبت صغيرا كان أو كبيرا قليلا كان أو كثيرا. He says, Rayyan, if you cry for Imam Hussein to such an extent that a tear flows down your cheek, then Allah will forgive you for all sins that you have committed, whether they are small or great, whether they are few or many. يا ابن شبيب إن سرك أن تلقى الله عز وجل ولا ذنب عليك فزر الحسين عليه السلام. If you want to meet Allah on the Day of Judgment without any sin, or meet him in a sinless state, then go and do ziyarah of Imam Hussein عليه السلام. يا ابن شبيب إن سرك أن تسكن الغرف المبنية في الجنة مع النبي صلى الله عليه وآله فلعن قتلة الحسين عليه السلام. And if you want to be placed in these grand castles in paradise on the Day of Judgment with the Prophet himself, then send your curse and your la'an on those who murdered Imam Hussein alayhi salam. يا ابن شبيب إن سرك أن يكون لك من الثواب مثل ما لمن استشهد مع الحسين عليه السلام فقل متى ما ذكرته يا ليتني كنت معهم فأفوز فوزا عظيما. He says, if you want to have the same reward that those people had who were martyred with Imam Hussein alayhi salam, then whenever you remember them, whenever you remember his companions and their martyrdom, then say this phrase, I wish I could have been with them and I could have achieved the same success that they had. يا ابن الشبيب إن سرك أن تكون معنا في الدرجات العلى في الجنان فاحزن لحزننا وافرح لفرحنا. If you want to be with us, the Ahlul Bayt, at our level in paradise, then align yourselves with our emotions. When we're happy and we have cause to be happy, you be happy. When we have cause to be sad, you also feel that sadness. وَعَلَيْكَ بِوِلَايَتِنَا, and align yourself with us. فَلَوْ أَنَّ رَجُلًا تَوَلَّى حَجَرًا لَحَشَرَهُ اللَّهُ تَعَالَى مَعَهُ يَوْمَ الْقِيَامَةِ. Whatever alliance a person has, with whatever he's aligned, he'll be raised with that ally on the Day of Judgment. So if you want to be with us, then have the wilaya of the authority of that we have in your hearts, and have a commitment to that, and you'll be raised with us, inshallah. So we have an opportunity. We weren't there at Karbala, but we have an opportunity to be with them, with the companions of Hussein, with Imam Hussein, with the Ahlul Bayt, by doing our job in these commemorations, by commemorating him in a way that's useful for us, where the emotions are brought to the fore, where we can cry for him and establish this emotional connection with him, inshallah. And even a tear can, inshallah, be an intercessor for us on the Day of Judgment, to raise us to the level of the Ahlul Bayt. السلام عليك يا أبا عبد الله وعلى الأرواح التي حلت بفنائك عليك مني جميعا سلام الله أبدا ما بقيت وبقي الليل والنهار ولا جعله الله آخر العهد مني لزيارتكم. السلام على الحسين وعلى علي بن الحسين وعلى أصحاب الحسين وعلى أولاد الحسين. Allah, we ask you to shower your mercy and blessings on Muhammad and the family of Muhammad. Allah, have mercy on us and forgive us for our sins. Help us, Allah, during these 10 days to commemorate Imam Hussein in a way that's pleasing to you. Help us to benefit from these commemorations. Help us to draw close to the Ahlul Bayt. Help us to follow in their footsteps and act on their sunnah and their seerah. Make them our intercessors on the Day of Judgment, and forgive us for our sins for their sake. وآخر دعوانا الحمد لله رب العالمين. اللهم صل